When I was a grad student at Vanderbilt, I took a field placement one semester in a mental health center in Bowling Green, Kentucky, to get supervised experience in counseling. And a young psychologist on the staff there had a bumper sticker on his car that read, "Happiness is an inside job." And I spent weeks trying to figure out what that meant. I assumed there was some obscure psychological insight, some tongue-in-cheek message that I just couldn't figure out. So I finally just gave up and asked him. And the actual meaning was not obscure at all. In fact, it was so basic it should have been obvious. He said, after 1 year of working in construction through the bitter cold of winter and the heat of summer, I was inspired to go back to college so I could have a job where I worked inside. It was probably a meaningless exchange for him, but I remember it from 30 years ago because for me it was like a moment with a Zen master. I grew up in rural Kentucky, surrounded by tenant farmers and the crushing poverty of the majority of those who were trying to scratch out a living out of what was actually fairly poor agricultural land. When I hauled hay or housed tobacco, it was for extra spending money. For them, it was survival. I've milked cows by hand, but I did it as a novelty. They did it to keep from starving to death. Though my parents could not afford to send me to college, and in fact, the cultural assumption that I was going to go to college was just a part of the mythology of the family. So even though I didn't grow up in a family that could afford it, I grew up in a family where there was a sense of moral oughtness and obligation, which sets you out a little bit ahead of the rest of the crowd. Now, I've done hard manual labor as a kid on the farm, and as an adult, I've helped to build houses in the Andes in Ecuador and in the heat of Managua, Nicaragua. I remember one day after carrying concrete block and mixing mortar on the ground with a shovel in Central America, where electricity is rare at building sites. They dig a little depression in the ground, pour in sand, and then some cement, and then they dump in water, and a couple of guys take shovels and turn it, and you just walk around it in a circle until you get that soupy mix of mortar just right, and then you shovel it into 10-gallon buckets, put it on your shoulder, and carry it up to the building site. My friend Bill Ringo, that I go diving with, who is a decade older than I am, was down there with me one time, and as we were struggling at the end of the day to get back to our hotel room, I said, "Bill, are you okay?" And he just stopped and looked at me and said, "If I hurt just this much more, I would sit down right here and start crying like a little girl." But it was for us 5 days of manual labor in what Bill now fondly refers to as Gandhi camp. After 5 days, we were on our way back to the United States and sitting in an airplane making our plans for our next scuba diving trip. My life's not charmed. I've had some real tough blows to endure, and I've had to put in some pretty long hours of demanding work, but with rare exception, I work indoors. I take a lunch break. I always have access to both health care and a safe place to sleep, running water, and flushing toilets. I've been in parts of the world where you didn't have those things just enough to know that if you hate cleaning your toilets, you should try it without them for a little while. And you discover what an honor it is to have toilets to clean. But more than that, I was born into the dominant race of the dominant gender in the dominant nation of the world. There is no predictor of success in life that is greater than being born white, male, heterosexual, and Protestant in North America. It is fair for everyone in the world to compete for the same finish line in a race as long as they have the same starting line. But white men in America get a solid head start long before minorities or women ever get to start the race. White privilege is not just a thing, it's an almost undefeatable thing, even while it defies definition and detection. We're sometimes just mystified by the complaints of minorities because from the perspective, particularly the perspective of a white male in the middle class, it looks like we live in a universe where everything is equal and maybe even the scale is tipped in the favor of minorities. But if you're on the other side of the fence, and even with the complaints that we've had from the University of Missouri lately from minority students, there are so many people that just don't see it, just don't understand. And naturally, they found an African-American student here at MSU to cry out that it was an unfair complaint. And that is just how weird white privilege is. It is sometimes so hard to see that even minorities refuse to accept its presence. For those of you who, like me, watched both of the Republican debates on TV that have taken place so far, the mere fact that white male millionaires can look into a camera and say with a straight face that salaries in America are too high, when the greatest challenge to the continued existence of our country as a capitalist democracy is income disparity, and they're even able to say income disparity is the largest single issue, and still look straight into a camera and say, no, I don't favor a raise in the minimum wage. Wages in America are too high and have to be lowered for us to be competitive. If you've ever doubted white privilege, just play that clip again. They can pay lip service to the fact that wage disparity is destroying our country, but their only solution to it, when asked point blank, is to make it even worse. If I may mix my literary genres, images just a bit, they sounded to me very much like an odd combination of Voldemort and Ebenezer Scrooge. I don't want to make Ben Carson a running theme in my preaching for the next several months, but as the minority on the stage who said that the United States went from its birth to being the dominant economic force in the world in 1 century because, he said, of the positive economic environment. A black man saying that our country's first 100 years saw an economic rise because of the positive economic environment in what most historians call slavery. Or as I think Stephen Colbert called our uncompensated intern program that we ran in the United States for a couple of 100 years. But folks, as we near our Thanksgiving observance, I would like to add one more thing to our awareness of white privilege in America. As morally bankrupt as the treatment of European settlers was of their African slaves, and as horrible as the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans was, and the historical aspect that usually goes untold, is the fact that the takeover of North America from tens of millions of Native Americans who were living here was largely because of the diseases that we brought from Europe. So unprepared to face the illnesses that most Europeans had learned to survive were the native tribes that entire villages of Native Americans simply collapsed under the weight of their casualty count. There were villages where people died so fast in such numbers that they didn't even bury their dead. They abandoned their villages. And along with it, a lot of why we know so little about Native American spirituality is that the death toll was so high and so fast that they abandoned their spiritual artifacts and many of their rituals because they believed their gods had turned against them. The reason why there are so many cities in America with Field as their last name. There's more than 40 Springfields in the United States, a lot of Mansfield, Fairfield, Greenfield, and so on, is because as the settlers moved west, they simply found fields that had been abandoned. They had been cleared, and if you think about taking a walk at the Nature Center and thinking, what if this was my farm? What would it take? with a horse and an axe and a saw to clear this and turn it into agricultural land. Many Indian fields, agricultural fields, were simply discovered because on our little wooden ships from Europe, we brought measles, scarlet fever, typhoid, typhus, influenza, pertussis, whooping cough, tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria, chickenpox, as well as a number of sexually transmitted diseases that the native population simply was not prepared to encounter. The arrival of large numbers of Europeans spelled near extinction for the American Indians, but it presented those settlers with vast resources of cleared farmland and a leg up on the rest of the world that was braced for an industrial revolution. So no one in modern America can claim to be a self-made person without acknowledging that our forebears inherited a continent from Native Americans and an infrastructure due in large part to the uncompensated labor of African slaves and barely compensated labor of Chinese road workers. Once the Civil War was over and slavery was wiped out, all the slave ships simply started going to Asia and capturing Chinese. To be shanghaied was a term that was brought up, that they would go to rural areas of China, tell them that they had jobs for them in Shanghai, and they would end up in California, that they were literally stolen from their families and put to work building America's railroads. And for all of the talk about building a wall between us and Mexico, the same people screaming for a wall now will be wanting to tear it down when they find out what our fruits and vegetables would cost with three-digit inflation year after year. No one who owns a farm, no one who owns a hotel, no one who owns a restaurant really wants to endure the spike in labor prices that would result if we actually had a wall between us and Mexico. Not to mention if we followed through with the deportation of millions upon millions of laborers. If wealth were actually predicated on hard work and frugality, the richest people in the world would not live in Silicon Valley. They would be sub-Saharan women who carry water on their heads and firewood on their backs day after day after day until they die. No one here in this room ever killed an Indian. No one here ever owned a slave. But everyone here has dramatically benefited from the theft of land from the Indians and the labor of African slaves. At this point, we are all connected. No one is an island, and no one can take credit for their success as a standalone event. Now, you can get a head start in a race and still lose it. We do have to engage in our own success, but no one can claim that whatever they have by virtue of their own hard work. Therefore, we have a very basic, moral, logical, just obligation to pay it forward to the next generation, to the next person who is trying to make it. Many of us here did not come from wealthy families who sent us to college. I not only worked and put myself through college, but in the latter years of my graduate school, my parents had fallen on economic hard times, and I had to help support them. The difference was, in the 1980s, you could do that. It could be done. Now it is not possible to do it. That era of American history in which a poor white guy from rural America could end up going to Harvard is just about over. There's very rare exceptions that people can emerge from that kind of poverty and have a shot at that kind of education. So with gratitude in our hearts for the opportunities that we have been given, for the nation and the culture which we inherited, we owe it to the next generation to make it possible for them to work their way through college, to earn enough from a job to eventually be able to buy a house, to save for retirement, and to choose to have 2 or 3 kids if their nerves can handle it. The perspective of selfishness that has become rampant in our nation is not just a failure of capitalism. It is a moral failing, a spiritual vacuum in which we really need to infuse a more responsible and mature appreciation with hearts filled with thanksgiving in order to give the people that come after us a fair shot at life. Power and greed have become the unnamed sacraments of our society, but that's not who we are. That's not who we choose to be. And that certainly is not what makes this or any other nation great. That is what made feudal Europe such an economic disaster that people wanted to flee to settle the New World. We can do better, and there is no time like the present to get started.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.